So, why exactly is Iran constantly at odds with the United States and Saudi Arabia? It's a question that completely dominates global headlines, yet the real answers are so often buried under layers of political rhetoric and shifting alliances. To really grasp why these nations are locked in this seemingly endless standoff, we can't just look at what happened yesterday. We actually have to peel back centuries of complex history, foreign intervention, and some incredibly deep seated religious divides.
Look at the situation today. Iran is facing crushing international sanctions. A huge chunk of its population is living in poverty, and the economy always seems to be teetering right on the brink. Yet, despite these massive internal struggles, Iran is out there aggressively funding, arming, and training militant proxy groups all across the Middle East. It's kind of wild when you think about it, right? Why sacrifice your own economy to fight foreign proxy wars? It's a totally fascinating contradiction.
Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the deep roots of the US-Iran conflict. We're going to connect today's chaotic headlines directly to centuries of history to uncover the exact moments that turned former allies into sworn enemies. All right, let's jump right in. Section 1, the Middle East power struggle. Before we even talk about foreign intervention, we absolutely must look at the neighborhood Iran lives in. Following the death of the Prophet Muhammad, a succession conflict deeply divided the Muslim community. To put that into perspective today, roughly 90% of the global Muslim population is Sunni, only about 10% are Shia. And Iran, well, they happen to be the largest Shia majority nation on earth. That places them at a massive, massive demographic disadvantage right out of the gate within a predominantly Sunni Muslim world.
And, it's not just a religious divide, it's a huge cultural one, too. Out of the 17 countries in the Middle East, 13 are Arab nations, meaning they're Arabic-speaking and Sunni-dominated. Iran is just fundamentally different. They are deeply rooted in ancient Persian culture, they speak Farsi, and, as we said, they're overwhelmingly Shia. This deep cultural and linguistic divide basically sets the stage for Iran being geographically and politically isolated from its own neighbors right from the start. Which brings us to Section 2, the battle for Ordos. To truly understand Iran's intense distrust of the West, we have to time travel back to the 19th and early 20th centuries. Back then, caught right between the rapidly expanding British and Russian empires, Iran was essentially dismantled piece by piece. Treaties in 1804 and 1856 stripped away land and naval rights. By 1890, the Iranian monarch literally handed the entire domestic tobacco industry over to the British, which totally devastated local traders. And then, in 1901, came the ultimate prize. A British guy named William Darcy was granted a 60-year concession to explore and extract Iran's oil. But the absolute core of the resentment here, it really comes down to a single number: 16. When massive oil reserves were finally struck, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was formed. But get this, under the agreement, Iran received a measly 16% of the profits from its own monumental oil fields. The overwhelming majority of that immense wealth flowed straight back to the British government. You can definitely imagine the intense, burning resentment this sparked among the Iranian public. So, in response to their monarchs just selling out the country's wealth, the public and religious leaders, known as the ulema, finally pushed back. They established the Majlis, which is essentially an Iranian parliament. This was a crucial structural shift. It was specifically designed to force a constitutional monarchy where religious scholars had actual, real political power to block decisions that were exploiting the country. But of course, the foreign interference didn't stop there. In 1921, with heavy British backing, a military leader named Reza Khan Pahlavi took over, and he pushed for rapid, forced modernization. We're talking banning burqas, mandating European hats, and pushing women into the workforce. But the catch, he did all of this while aggressively suppressing political parties, weakening the Majlis, and heavily increasing taxes on the poor. He completely alienated the deeply religious working class, basically putting a national pressure cooker in motion. That sets us up for Section 3, the 1979 Islamic Revolution. As we hit the critical mid-20th century era, direct United States intervention set an irreversible collision course. In 1951, Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh did the absolute unthinkable at the time. He nationalized Iran's oil, essentially kicking the British out. The US and UK responded with crippling sanctions. Then, in 1953, the CIA and MI6 staged a covert coup. They overthrew the democratically elected Mossadegh and reinstated the Shah, the monarch, with absolute US-backed power.
For so many Iranians, this was the exact moment foreign powers completely dismantled their right to govern themselves.
And that paves the way for Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Speaking from exile, he introduced an incredibly powerful religious ideology called the Layat-e-Faqih. He made the case that neither corrupt monarchy nor a Western-style democracy was going to work for them. Instead, he proposed an Islamic state governed solely by God's law, overseen by supreme religious scholars. This idea was a game-changer. It mobilized an incredibly angry, disenfranchised Iranian populace against the US-backed Shah.
What followed in the late 1970s was just this uncontrollable, incredibly violent cycle. Protests would break out against the Shah would send in the military, which resulted in tragic casualties, and then massively larger protests would erupt just to mourn the dead from the previous protest. It was a brutal loop the Shah simply couldn't break, completely collapsing the country's economy and eventually forcing him to flee to the US for medical treatment. Right after the Shah's exit, Khomeini returned to a hero's welcome. In April 1979, they held a national referendum, and the result? An overwhelming 98% of the voting population chose to establish an Islamic republic. It fundamentally changed Iran overnight, replacing a secular monarchy with a strict theocracy led by a supreme leader.
Then, the boiling over point came on November 4, 1979. Demanding that the U.S. return the fleeing Shah to face trial, Iranian protesters stormed the U.S. embassy in Tehran. They took 52 Americans hostage and held them for a staggering 444 days. That hostage crisis entirely shattered U.S.-Iran relations forever. In fact, it led directly to the U.S. officially declaring Iran a state sponsor of terrorism a few years later in 1984.
Let's move into the modern day with Section 4, the proxy war strategy. Bringing this historical narrative into the present, we have to ask, how does the heavily isolated Iran actually survive and project power today? Look at the geopolitical reality they face. On one side, you have Saudi Arabia, a strong U.S. ally, the recognized leader of the Sunni world, rich in oil, with a massive landmass but a smaller population of around 36 million. On the other side, Iran, boasting ancient history, heavily anti-US, the Shia leader, with a much larger population of 87 million, but squeezed into a smaller area. Iran deeply resents Saudi Arabia's leadership of the Muslim world, basically viewing them as being completely in the pocket of the US. Now, shortly after Iran's revolution, neighboring Iraq, led by Sunni leader Saddam Hussein, saw an opportunity and attacked. This kicked off the brutal Iran-Iraq war that lasted from 1980 to 1988. And what Iran learned from this was a hard truth. Nearly the entire Arab world, plus major Western powers, backed Iraq against them. Facing this isolated reality convinced Iran's leadership that they could never fight their enemies conventionally. They had to rely entirely on asymmetric, unconventional defense tactics. And that isolated reality is exactly what gave birth to Iran's massive proxy network. They use the Quds Force, which is their elite intelligence wing, to fund and arm groups everywhere. They back Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and notably Hamas in Palestine. And actually, it's super interesting because Hamas is a Sunni group, but Iran supports them anyway because they share a common goal of opposing Israel. For Iran, it's all about building an axis of resistance to project power indirectly. But alongside those proxies is the quest for the ultimate geopolitical shield, nuclear deterrence. To build a nuclear weapon, you need 90% uranium enrichment. Right now, Iran has enriched uranium to roughly 60%. For Iran, eventually crossing that 90% threshold basically means regime survival. Because, let's face it, two nuclear-armed states almost never engage in direct war. Unsurprisingly, this entire program is the target of constant sabotage and heavy international sanctions. So, we arrive at the core strategy we've uncovered today. Iran does not view its funding of proxy groups as a drain. They see it as a very long-term investment. They are engaged in a generational struggle for dominance in the Muslim world, and they are absolutely willing to let their domestic economy suffer immensely if it means maintaining their regional leverage against the US, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. Which leaves us with a critical question to consider as you watch the daily news unfold. Will Iran's incredibly high-stakes strategy of proxy warfare and the pursuit of nuclear deterrence finally secure its long-desired position as the undisputed regional leader? Or is it a path that will inevitably collapse under its own weight, leading to total economic ruin? It's an incredibly fragile balance of power built on a century of intervention and religious divide. Thank you for joining this explainer, and remember to keep questioning what you see.